a blaze, man a rage. Earth a blaze, man a rage. Man a be live in a shanty, shanty. Food and clothes, scanty, scanty. Cost of living gets so high. Man a be shopping with them. Them your days that even rain won't fall from sky.
To those who are joining us for the first time. This soundings of my brothers is the first of our afternoon panels. We're actually missing, as you can see, one of our confirmed panelists, where there's actually two. David Brown, he won't be joining us, as you may see on your program, but Donette Francis is around. We're just having a little trouble locating her. Our first presenter is Dave Goss, Senior Lecturer at the Institute for Caribbean Studies, UEMONA, and he will be looking at a false Christ, a false prophet, the colonial conspiracy to silence Bedward. Our second presenter is Tennyson Joseph, Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the UWKville campus, and he will be looking at decolonizing the university and the curriculum, the Caribbean State, and the UWI intellectuals since the Rodney riots. And he will be followed by Donette Francis, who is Director of the American Studies Program and Associate Professor in the Department of English at the University of Miami. Her paper is Rebellion or Riot, the October 1968 Confrontation in Campus novels. Each presenter will have about 15 to 20 minutes, after which we will have the general Q&A session. Thank you. Let's give our presenters a round of applause.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My presentation is entitled, oh, it's here. Okay, a false Christ, a false prophet, the colonial conspiracy to silence Bedward. Now, I'm currently looking at the papers of the Reverend George Olson and the Church of God missionaries to Jamaica, and in one of his letters, Olson spent about 4 or 5 pages discussing that part of moment in history when persons were leaving all across the island to come to AugustTown to witness Bedward's alleged ascension. And so he sent to his superiors overseas about 5 pages about Bedward. And actually, the title I actually have is actually Olson's title. So he was the field secretary of the Church of God Missions in Jamaica, co-founder of the Arden High School. And he writes then in that letter that this is the first time in Jamaica's history that there's a false prophet, right? And he continued by saying then that Bedward, not only is he a false prophet, but he's also financially scamming people. And so he sarcastically calls Bedward Prophet Bedward, making use of that particular analogy. He further argued that Bedward was charging persons 1 shilling in his numerous baptisms he had, and he had numerous baptisms, and at each of them he charged 1 shilling, and that he predicted his own ascension to heaven, and that he was going to judge the world. He and others would judge the world because he was the King of Kings and Lord of Lords and Master. They had to call him Master. His devoted servant had to call him Master, generally, right? So you could see right away the narrative that is framed by Bedward, which is not very dissimilar from the narrative of many of the missionaries at that time who were so opposed to Bedward. Now, other persons such as Anglican Bishop Enos Nuttall himself led a march in Kingston against Bedward. The Roman Catholic Bishop Gordon even issued a proclamation to be read in each Catholic church and school forbidding Catholics from visiting Bedward's healing streams or encouraging others to do so. Even persons in the medical profession lobbied the government's chemists to take samples of the water in Bedward's famous healing stream to prevent a public health crisis. Now, I must say from the very outset here that 2 of the persons who Bedward had stinging critiques against, doctors and pastors, right? And so it's not surprising that they are responding the way they are. I argue in this paper that Bedward was innocent of all the claims made against him. And why I argue that point was that based on what was happening in Jamaica in the 1920s, early 1920s, the governor, Sir Leslie Probyn, launched a thorough investigation on this person, Bedward, as a very thorough report which he submitted to his superiors in London. And in the 1921 report that he submitted to the Colonial Office overseas, he stated clearly that there was no scandal on Bedward which necessitated any colonial interference. There was no financial impropriety against Bedward, which I'll come to shortly, but generally, there was nothing that would necessitate colonial interference in stopping Bedward from what he was doing. As opposed to what the other missionaries and even the newspaper, the Daily Gleaner, was saying at that point in time. He argues that the Bedwardites, they were a curious sect which, in a sense, possessed greater enthusiasm than any literary ability. And then he argued importantly that since members of the purchased teacups, because that was one of the contentions made by other persons, that at some of the Bedward's particular meetings, at the end of the fast, you break the fast by drinking tea from a white cup and a white saucer. And each person had to buy one of those white cups and white saucers. And he makes the point that since members had to purchase teacups from Bedward, he could not have made any significant profit from it, because technically it was being resold at 6 shillings, pence, not 6 pence each, yeah, thanks, pence, 6 pence each. So what Bedward really bought the cocoa saucer for, to sell it for 6 pence, you couldn't really make any money from it. So he was not concerned about any financial impropriety against Bedward. Then also, at that time, the person who was in charge of the Lunatic Assembly in Jamaica wrote in his report that he studied Bedward as well, and this idea of the color white, it was something that he has, right? But there was nothing irregular or delusional about the color white. And if you know revivalist narrative and doctrines, colors are important to revivalists. And so white, there's nothing unusual about Bedward's color white. Again, so quite clearly that in the colonial office scheme, Bedward, there was nothing serious about Bedward. Williams further makes the point that the white teacup was an emblem of purity, and the Spirit of God instructed Bedward to use it. That's what Bedward argued, right? He was instructed to use it when you're breaking their fast. Thus, his use of white cup and saucers was highly ritualistic for liturgical purposes, rather than a sign of mental illness. Now, I further argue then, now the governor further actually sent copies of Bedward's, the constitution of the church, the polity of the church, the members of the church, and the chapters where they're from, and how much money they send. It was a very, very thorough report sent to a colonial office. And in that particular document, he made a point that he was struck even by Bedward's use of introducing what he calls this kind of distinction between what he calls practical sin and actual sin. So in a sense, he was actually impressed with the Bedward movement in terms of its theology and its seriousness in ensuring that they offer a kind of a religious theology for people. But there was nothing toward the movement which made of any serious concern. So why was Bedward targeted? He was targeted because the movement was clearly international and island-wide. That same document that the governor sent showed the enormity of the Bedward movement. And even also in the report, when he wrote his report, he was actually coming from Anatole Bay and saw people walking from Anatole Bay coming to AugustTown. So it was quite clear, it was international, it was extensive, but more important, Bedward was a highly charismatic leader who was loved by the working class and also independent of the colonial system, right? And so he targeted doctors and pastors predominantly, and as such, it was stuck against him. But I also argue then that this idea of madness then was a flexible social construct used by the colonialists as a weapon of social control for persons such as Bedward. And these are comments by persons in the assembly at that time who argued that the island was being overrun with these religious fanatics, and Bedward was their hero, and somebody had to pay the price actually for what is happening, right? The argument really was that Bedward seemed to have been okay, but he had this power and this charisma and control over people that they were afraid that he could use his ability, and the masses who were ignorant and excitable could have carried it to another level, so Bedward had to be stopped. And this is what I argue here, then, why he had to be stopped. No, so in 1895, then, he was charged for sedition, and the trial of this particular case shows how much Bedward had to be stopped. At the trial, it was clear from reading the trial note that for the last 3 years, they sent a police persons to Bedward's meeting every week for 3 continuous years. And on one occasion then, it was alleged now then that on this occasion now he cursed the governor, and as such then was charged for sedition. Now, this one of the policemen who was actually present, a sergeant, when he was asked for his report of what Bedward said, he pointed that Bedward did not accuse the governor, right? And the inspector asked him to rewrite his statement again. And he was not satisfied, and he was immediately transferred from Halfway Tree Police Station to Port Maria. Other policemen who were also there were also, if they didn't go in line with what the inspector said, they were not listed to give evidence against Bedward, right? And it's at the trial then that Bedward's lawyer brought this out. And so there are numerous, what I would want to call irregularities at that part of the trial. For example, the same police inspector said that he wrote the notes on his shirt sleeve. And then when he went home later, he transcribed it to his book. And so the lawyer, Bedward's lawyer, actually showed that there were a lot of irregularities at the trial. At the end of the trial now, the judge now gave a very interesting prediction to the jury. He asked the jury then that apart from declaring Bedward innocent or guilty, they can also declare him guilty because he's mad. And that's what the jury agreed. And so Bedward was charged with being guilty because he was insane, but the lawyer now used that then to actually get Bedward off. Because technically, in Jamaican law, once you're guilty, you can't be guilty and be sent to an institution because you're insane. So you have to be released. But what happened then? That Bedward got off. The very next year, the Jamaican Assembly ensured that the Jamaican law now then had something to say about lunacy. So 70 provisions were done. The first section shows clearly any police constable can arrest any person wandering at large under circumstances indicating that he's a lunatic and dangerous and bring him to a JP. Once the JP now will have the right now then to listen to him and to observe him for 10 days and then agree that he's a lunatic and send him off to the asylum. As a result of that then, you find that from 1896 down, there's an increase of persons being sent to the lunatic assembly. So I'll go to this chart quickly. Asylum, yes, lunatic asylum. Sorry. If you look at this chart, for example, in 1885 to 86, there were 531 patients. By 1906, you are seeing 1291. By 1909, 1320. Okay, by 1913, 1632. It's increasing at an exponential rate. And by 1916, 1730, persons are now being sent now to the lunatic asylum at this point in time. And I argue then that this particular law is part of the reason. Now, Bedward was declared mad and sent to the asylum, but there are a number of persons who were now dragged all across the part of Jamaica. You're seeing persons now who are being taken in, sent to the asylum based on the fact that they are mad. So for example, you'll see here, for example, that in 1895, 87% of those who were sent from the parish courts. And what were some of the issues that they said why they were mad? One, dementia, being an imbecile, which is just saying you're a fool, chronic mania, epileptic mania. So it is quite clear that a number of persons then are just being dragged, and the law provided that as a result of Bedward. Now, most of these particular individuals then, we would argue that like dementia, for example, now we know today that it is a condition, especially in an older age. Epilepsy, again, is a condition that many people can have. But those are not conditions which should send one to the lunatic asylum. So like Bedward then, all these persons now then were declared with mental problems. Now, you might believe then that the persons who are being sent to the asylum then are older persons. But in this part of year 1903 to 1904, you will see then that the persons 20 to 30 years are being sent mainly, and then 30 to 40 years. So again, it's not older people who the courts have a problem with what to do with them. Obviously, these are people now who, for some reason, either young revivalists, or for some reason, they are seen as troublemakers, and they just give them attach a label to them and actually send them actually off. I'm doing very well. 1 minute to go. All right. All right. So I argue then, I conclude then that in colonial Jamaica then, declaration of madness, like the banning of radicals like Rodney, were all tools in the colonial toolbox. Bedward shared with Rodney the heavy arm of the colonial state and its organs. His independence of the colonial state, that is Bedward, and his vast influence challenged the colonial order. Through colonial lens, therefore, then, you had to be mad to pose such a challenge. Rodney, like Bedward, paid the eventual price and that's why today in folklore we call him, he's deemed as mad. One part of the research that I need to conclude on now is the latter part where he said it is alleged he said you're going to fly to heaven. Now, if and I haven't fully examined those part of the stories as yet, but if those stories are similar to these stories, most likely, again, they are taken out of context. And probably that's part of the reason then why he was eventually declared as mad, and because the reports which are being written in the context, yes, that he's mad, and as such then has come down to us today. But I declare from my particular reading of this text that it was the colonial authority way of silencing people like Bedward to ensure that somebody had to pay the price for the benefit of the colonial state. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. This spark, which ignited the flames of the themes which I'm going to examine in this paper, was lit in August 2016, when a lecture which I delivered in St. Vincent and the Grenadines was largely criticized by a senior opposition figure in that country on the basis that my lecture was, and I quote, typical UE. I responded by indicating my uncertainty of the criterion against which the typical UE was determined. I indicated to the MP that the only way of determining what was typically UE would be by having full knowledge of all the intellectual productions of the full complement of staff across the entire UE system, and then to demonstrate that the staff always shares the same fixed views on all matters all the time. I expressed my own inability to perform such a feat, since I could never pretend to be familiar enough with all the intellectual productions of the UE to allow me to pronounce on what was typical insofar as research interests, ideological outlook, philosophical stances, mode of engagement, and other things were concerned. However, despite the weakness of the MP's effort at identifying what is typical UE, some larger questions emerge. What is the social and historical context which might explain a senior Caribbean MP's claim to the existence of a typical UE? From where did his offhanded and confident presumption of a typical UWI emanate? Why would an argument which was perceived as being anti-systemic, or at the very least critical of the status quo, be perceived as typical of UE intellectual productions? What are the class and intellectual perspectives which could have led a senior Caribbean MP to first assume the existence of a typical UE academic perspective, and secondly, to frame his disagreement with that perspective as a rejection of his assumed typical UE? It was an attempt to grapple with questions like these that the concerns raised in my paper today are framed. My paper locates a latent and ever-present hostility to the UWI, as captured in the specific case which I was describing just now, in the historical tensions which exist between Caribbean state leaders and the University of the West Indies. The tension, I hypothesize, is rooted, among other explanations, in a general anti-intellectualism on the part of the state leadership, which makes the University of the West Indies a specifically easy target for state hostility. It is often fed by the expectation by state leaders of a subordinate role for the university, in which the academy is expected to serve as a furnisher of technical experts to advance dominant state interests rather than as a center of intellectual critique of the society and the provider of a normative, prescriptive recommendations which may sometimes run counter to dominant state perspectives. A central source of the tension is the persistence of examples of the UWI academic as a politically engaged activist academic, not, by the way, in the majority, and very, very much in the minority, but that point has to be made, both in the narrow partisan sense as well as in the wider organic sense of identification with ideological and class groupings. The activist academic stands in counter distinction from the neutral academic model, which was famously championed by the UWI's first native West Indian principal, W.R. Lewis, which I'm not going to go into that now. And the continuing presence has always served as a caricature against which the UWI is perceived as radical by state managers. Finally, it is hypothesized further that these tensions cannot be separated from the economic environment and the institutional economic arrangements sustaining the university. In a context of a traditional funding model in which home governments provide significant amounts of funding to the UWI and sit on its governing councils, Caribbean leaders cannot extricate themselves from a view that the academic is an employee of the government. Much of the tension between the UWI and the Caribbean leaders spring from the inability of the university to conform to this employee-like expectation, or unwillingness, I should say. These tensions are often exacerbated during periods of economic challenge when governments face greater difficulties with meeting their financial obligations, and when ideological tensions about public funding of education or the wider economic directions of the state in moments of neoliberal dominance widen the distance between the state and the academy. So these are the broad assumptions of the paper on which I am now working, and some of the hypotheses through which I'm approaching the task. Let me say up front that my paper is still a work in progress, and there is a huge gap in ambition between the aims of the title which is advertised in your program and the title with which I am working today. Thus, whilst your advertised title is, as you can see, Decolonizing the University and the Curriculum, the Caribbean State, and the UWI Intellectuals Since the Rodney Riots, the title with which I am working today is Decolonizing the University, the Caribbean State, the UWI, and the UWI Intellectuals Since the Rodney Riots. It is proposed that in a more complex work, I will deal with the issues dealing with decolonizing the curriculum and so forth, but I am not going to do that today. For today's less ambitious paper, I wish to utilize the moment of the 50th anniversary of Rodney's riots to assess the relationships between the Caribbean state and the Caribbean intellectuals employed with UWI. Why there are several lessons and underlying themes and intellectual streams of inquiry which have emerged from the ideas of Walter Rodney and from the Rodney 68 events themselves. Amongst the central issues enmeshed in the events surrounding the Rodney affair were questions of the attitude of the post-colonial political leadership to the university, the understanding of the political leadership on the question of the role of the West Indian intellectual and his place in post-colonial development and his relationship to power, and in particular, the role of the university in post-colonial development. The paper therefore sees it as useful to explore how those questions have played themselves out in specific UWI state conflicts since Rodney. So for today's presentation, I'm going to do three very specific things. First, I will start by exploring Rodney himself and present his perspective on the role of the university in the Caribbean and post-colonial Africa, showing its inherently anti-systemic nature and showing why it clashed against colonial and post-colonial notions of the role of the university assumed by the Caribbean ruling elite. Following this, I will explore briefly what I call two authoritative historical accounts of the Rodney riots and the aftermath, the account by Gonzalez and the account by Rupert Lewis. And I will show how these accounts throw up for us the essential outlines of the nodes of conflict between the UWI and the state, which we can use as a template for assessing future conflicts between the UWI and Caribbean governments. And thirdly, the paper will turn to its empirical case, and for the empirical case, I will discuss the moment of conflict between the Barbadian state and the UWI, roughly between 2013 and 2016, when the Friendel Stewart-led administration had embarked upon a policy of ending free universal tertiary education for Barbadian citizens, as part of which the government sought to delegitimize the Cave Hill campus, its academics, and inclusive then too of the then principal and current vice chancellor, Sir Hilary Beckles. And the paper will conclude with a brief discussion of the differences, if any, in the expressions of tensions between the state and the UWI and the lessons of the Rodney 1968 period for the present. So first, quickly, let me turn to Walter Rodney very, very quickly. So the main thing I want to suggest is that Rodney provides for us inherently the perspective which he provides on the role of the university would have led him inevitably on a collision course with post-colonial Caribbean states. Rodney's perspective was based on the assumption that since the colonial experience had so damaged African and Caribbean society, then a university was meant to play a role in remaking or repairing the society from its colonial wounds. More profoundly, given the cultural and civilizational differences, particularly between Africa, but also the Caribbean on one hand, and the European world on the other, Rodney was of the view that the purpose and function of education meant very different things for the post-colonial world than it did for Europe. How Rodney conceived of the role of education, and by extension the role of the university, ran diametrically counter to the role anticipated by the colonial authorities. One of the clearest places where Rodney's prescriptions on the role of education can be seen is in the 1974 publication called Education and Black Struggle, Notes from the Colonized World. And in that publication, Rodney wrote an article called Education in Africa and Contemporary Tanzania, and he was comparing the assumptions about education in pre-colonial Africa and what colonial education meant. So he was contrasting the two. So I'll just go through that briefly. So he was telling us that in Africa, education is understood in one way, and in Europe, it is another way. So he identifies quickly the problem of elitism, and he says that in pre-colonial Africa, the African educational system was meant to provide education for everybody, whilst in the colonial order, it was only for the minority. A second was that, according to him, it was meant to engage the African personality in Africa, in pre-colonial Africa, to develop consciousness of the relationship to their environment and to their ancestors, whilst under colonial education, it was designed to educate the few, and that resulted in them being alienated from the mass base of the people as a whole. So education was not meant to reinforce the connection between those educated in the formal system and the rest of the population. He also saw pre-colonial education in Africa as residing in the communal nature of the society, whilst in contrast, colonial education was meant to impart bourgeois values as far as it was concerned, dealing with competition and so forth. And there was a link between theory and practice in the pre-colonial modes of education in Africa, in which one was learning about life and in which education was geared to the needs of the society and the environment, whilst under colonial education, what were promoted were what he called Christian values and doing certain types of low-level bureaucratic work. So you would see, but he was arguing that this kind of education, Africans who experienced it found that they could no longer relate to their own home communities, or that they had tremendous difficulties doing so. And so that's why he made his prescriptions, which were to overcome them, and famously captured in the groundings with my brothers, right? So this is my quick summary of Rodney's theory of colonial education versus anti-colonial education. And we're going to use it as a measuring stick, or we can use it as a measuring stick for determining whether you are decolonizing education or not. So just very quickly, to extract from Rupert Lewis and Gonzalez some of the main themes that came out of the Rodney incident. I have them listed in bullet point form, and I'll just go through them quickly because I'm challenged for time. But we heard a lot about the petty nationalism of the Jamaican state. Coming out of the experience, we saw evidence of the anti-intellectualism of the state. This morning we heard a lot to talk about petty nationalism, but that petty nationalism, I don't think it was real. It was really an expression of the anti-intellectualism and the hostility to the UE because it was a regional institution. So because they were anti-intellectual and the main institution that you were confronting was original, you had to express that anti-intellectualism in the most convenient way of petty nationalism. So it was not Jamaican petty nationalism, it was the anti-intellectualism of the state reflecting itself as a critique, as this false critique about Jamaican nationalism and non-Jamaican people and so forth. Okay? There was, of course, the lesson of the alliance between the intellectuals and the class. There were considerations about anti-communism and Cold War considerations. There were also attempts to attach the academics to rival political parties and so forth. And we could see there also instances of the pressuring of the administration, famously captured in what was done to Vice Chancellor Philip Sherlock in relation to accusing him of breaching cabinet confidentiality, although he was not a member of cabinet, and so forth, because he gave an alternative view on what the riots meant and so forth. And essentially, there was an attempt to assert a subordinate role for the university and the state. So these were the main takeaways of the Rodney riots. Now, this is my broad, long task, which I hope to do in a larger work, and I'm just asking for some help, maybe in the discussion. In the larger work, we can look at several different instances of UE state conflicts, and I have them listed here. So if you see any gaps in there, maybe in the discussion afterwards, you can suggest to me. But the main one I want to do very quickly is to spend some time updating you on the story of the Barbadian state and during the period of the Fendel Stewart administration reversing the free education policy in Barbados and how we saw certain actions taken against the university or certain responses taken towards the Cavell campus. So I am suggesting that there were a number of reasons why Cavell campus was targeted in a particular way. My argument is that if you had a problem with student numbers and if you had a genuine problem with costs, it did not have to descend to an anti-intellectual attack and almost a kind of delegitimizing of the university. You could have had a discussion about costs and student numbers and leave that out. But the instinctive anti-intellectualism allowed us to see the same things that we saw basically during the Rodney period. So I'm suggesting that there may be reasons why Cavell was targeted in the way that it was before I go into showing you what the state did. The principal, for example, was the key champion of the policy of one graduate per household. There was also the close association of the former prime minister with enlarging the UE and expanding programs and student numbers and so forth, and identified he was tied to Hilary Beckles as also a state leader of the principle of one graduate per household. There was a sense of betrayal on the part of the DLP government of those academics like both Hilary Beckles and George Bell and Ras Eichel Tafari, who were in the 1970s and so forth, and the 80s, key radicals associated with the DLP. But during the Owen Arthur period, they had more or less become co-opted by Arthur's politics of inclusion, largely to do with Arthur's attitude towards UE. As academics, they both went along with Arthur's developmental plan for UE. And so the new government coming in targeted them specifically as part of its attack on Owen Arthur. And of course, the final point I have there has to do with the fact that academics themselves were key voices in opposition to the abolition of the free education policy, then automatically that put them in a position of opposition to the new government. But what I want to show is how that attack took place. First, among the things we saw is the fact that it was the engaged intellectuals that were attacked publicly. So the model of the activist intellectual. So when the university is being attacked, it is not every academic. When the state managers speak of the university, they're referring to 2 or 3 individuals who they generically apply and enlarge to the whole university. But the ones that they have a major problem with are the activist academics, those who write in the papers, those who engage with the newspapers, those who ground with different groups. And that tells you that the Rodney model is the one that they see as antithetical to their own interests. We also saw examples of narrow attacks on non-Barbadian academics. So what we were hearing about Jamaican nationalism, we saw it in Barbados too. The classic case for me was when a very conservative economist was invited by the Barbados Chamber of Commerce, of all groups, to give a post-budget discussion. And all he said is the standard things that the economists always say, the government should focus on expenditure as opposed to revenue because there's no revenue problem. And the debate in Parliament, his name was mentioned and he was called a Grenadian and he shouldn't have been criticizing the Barbados government and so forth. The most shocking thing for me was when one of the parliamentarians pulled out the UE report, the annual report, and was citing that lecturers, when you list your activities. And he had cited that he had served as an advisor to the opposition leader. And they were pointing that, raising that in the parliament to show that he was a partisan academic. My question was, it hasn't been answered yet. Who is the person who gave those parliamentarians that annual report? Because I was the head of the department, and I can't tell you what the economists are doing or what the people in chemistry are doing. But that politician pulled out a report and is telling us what an economist has listed as his activities and so forth. So all of them, I have them listed here, so I will not detain you any longer. But these are the kind of things that were going on and so forth. The final one for me I'll leave you with is your own vice-chancellor now. When he was announced as the vice-chancellor, one would have thought the principal who's Barbadian, the principal Barbadian would have been praised by the prime minister. You know, Barbadians are very proud people. Instead, the prime minister went public and denounced him and told him to leave his bad manners in Barbados, and he hoped he doesn't bring his bad manners to Jamaica. There was not one congratulatory message or official statement congratulating Hilary Beckles for being the vice-chancellor of the university. So on the issue itself, I have some things to raise. The actual struggle against free education, what we saw is that I'm saying we saw similar things that we saw in Jamaica, but I have some worrying concerns. First of all, there was a general failure of the students to mobilize against the decision. Now, in last night's discussion, we heard questions about mobilization. But if the government is ending a policy that began in the mid-1960s of free education, and the students could not mobilize around that issue, there was generally weak leadership on the part of the students. I think the guild president was very weak. He was basically starstruck by the prime minister. I used to speak to him, and the most he would tell me is that he just met the prime minister and he was almost starstruck that he had met the prime minister. But there was no substantive action, no serious response on the part of the students. The students generally they felt defeated. They basically felt that nothing could be done, and they would wait until the government changed for them to get their education back. Shockingly, there was no support from the non-Barbadian students. The Eastern Caribbean students were pursuing the line that the Barbadian students have to pay so that they would take their education more seriously. The kind of notions of efficiency and wastage was part of their discourse. And the staff was divided, largely along party lines, and with only a handful of lecturers standing for the students. There was one little demonstration of about 70 students, and there were about 2 meetings between some lecturers and a political leader and the students, but probably the room was probably about the size of this current room there. So I want to conclude with that to suggest that, and I'll stop now. In our meeting with MIX, there's a lot of discussion about organization and mobilization and whether students can organize. But on reflecting on the Barbadian case that I was trying to present, I reached the conclusion that there were neoliberal ideas and individualism was so hegemonic that there was no need to ban books or deport any lecturers, because the neoliberalism had a built-in prison that prevented any large-scale mobilization, as you saw in Rodney. It prevented any large-scale mobilization on the part of the students. It prevented any large-scale alliances between students, lecturers, and the wider public. And that is what I'm saying here. And I'm concluding with the statement that it is because of the hegemony of neoliberalism and its debilitating consequences that Rodney's model of the activist scholar and decolonizing education becomes even more critical. I thank you.
Good afternoon. Let me see if this is, do I need to maybe that will work. Okay, I think that's good. So I want to begin by thanking Suzanne Francis Brown and Matthew Smith and their team for mounting the exhibit and organizing this conference that gives us the opportunity to revisit and learn a lot more about the period. So getting the opportunity last night and to be able to go back before I leave to see all the archival materials that you've gathered has just been invaluable. So today I'm going to talk about one campus novel that addresses university life, that faithful 1968 to 1969 school year at Mona. So a campus novel is basically what its name suggests. It addresses life on a university campus, usually from the point of view of the professor, and it often satirizes their simultaneous quest for social revolution and self-actualization. When it's told from the point of view of a student, it's referred to as a varsity novel. You will see that this novel blurs those distinctions, and I'll be suggesting that the novel prompts us to ask 4 questions. So 1, what it means to entangle the political with the intimate. 2, what it means to approach Kingston as an outsider, and we've been hearing a lot of talk about that, and so by outsider I mean a non-Jamaican person. 3, was the October confrontation transformative, and how so? Or how do we judge transformations that matter? And then 4, how does the novel move from marking the circumstances of a public riot to the long-standing impact of a personal rebellion? So N.D. Williams' 1976 Casa de las Americas prize-winning novel, Aikal Taras, unfolds through the meanderings of a protagonist, Michael Abensetz, a middle-class Guyanese student making his way as a first-year undergraduate at the University of the West Indies, Mona, in the 1968-69 academic year. We first encounter Michael during his high school years in Guyana as readers come to understand how, born in Montreal, he's shaped by the childhood loss of his mother and the strained relationship with his father. Structured in 3 parts, part 1 captures the class and color sociology of his all-boys school, whereas the son of a government minister, he is among the privileged. The novel opens with Michael trying to inconspicuously depart from Georgetown via taxi while his father is away on government business in New York. He gets to Port of Spain but misses the final leg of his flight to Kingston and instead has to overnight in Port of Spain, where he meets up with Taletta, an Indo-Guyanese making her way to Mona to study medicine. So when they finally land in Kingston, our aimless narrator makes his way through Mona, College Camp, College Commons and its surroundings, spending little time in lecture halls and more time roaming the dorm halls, party venues of the city's intellectual elite. For a first-year undergraduate, Michael has a lot of access to university professionals. Consequently, his journey entails intimate conversations with poets, university lecturers, and his lecturer lover, who at 30 years old is 12 years his senior. A walker in the city, Michael walks, takes the bus, and gets rides from one location and one party to another. Through his probing conversations with those who cross his path, readers are privy to conversations about Cuba, Federation, Rastafarianism, and how small islanders revere Jamaica as the big island to their north. Altogether, then, readers are invited to see Jamaica's middle and working classes from the perspective of a student outsider from Georgetown who, by the novel's end, has dropped out of school and taken up residence in a Rasta camp. As a campus or varsity novel of UWI in 1968, Aikal is invaluable for the portrayal of our mid-20th century Caribbean regional campus 20 years into its operation. And as such, it defies a then emerging subgenre more associated with and chronicled from the perspectives of North Atlantic academic institutions. But the setting is academic year 1968-69 at Mona, and 222 pages into the 501 pages of this middle-class picturesque meanderings of our narrators, readers arrive at the Walter Rodney affair. The event itself is written in a Naipaulahan fashion to capture the spontaneity, the theatricality, and to ultimately characterize the carnivalesque elements of this student-organized march. So not surprisingly, the day of the riot finds Michael waking up in a stupor, having had too much to drink at a fete the evening before. As he struggles to orient himself to the new day, a flatmate asks him if he's not marching, and where is his Black Power poster? His stream of consciousness narration follows, and I quote, "As I dressed, I tried to make more sense of what they'd said. It didn't sound like a joke, a Black Power demonstration with so much student bustle, so much pamphleteering on behalf of various student societies and loud, wasteful arguments about politics and revolution. I hadn't bothered to take any of it seriously. I was hearing about this one for the first time and was prepared to dismiss the whole thing as more campus frolic under an extraordinarily new pretext. Was not student militancy, as reportedly lavish in the time, the current madness of the American youth? And so we were having one. A few fireable imaginations had fired. But as I strolled over to PG's flat, meaning to scrounge a late breakfast, I couldn't help but noticing that the place was weirdly empty. People had gone off to do something sensational, not to lecturers. There was a decidedly huge vacancy," end quote. He then seeks out his older and cynical Trinidadian friend who recounts the last evening's happenings in the halls. There was a quote, "There was a whole heap of shouting and banging on doors and all through last night. Apparently they got the news around about midnight that this lecturer, you know, that Black Power man, had been refused entry at the airport. And this Volkswagen kept driving around with a loudspeaker screaming, 'Urgent general meeting, all students out.' So they decided they'd march downtown to the Ministry of External Affairs today. You should have seen the girls making posters as if they were preparing for carnival," end quote. So, and this is still the dialogue. "You mean I slept through all that? Yes, man, you missed all the excitement. Heaven knows we need this kind of distraction now and again, or we die of sheer boredom," end quote. So referred to in the text as riot rather than rebellion, Michael's narration of the event aligns with what the critic Eddie Chamber reminds us, that no one knows when the precise confluence of factors will occur that will spark into a riot. What we do know is that leadership arises out of such historical occasions, and his Indo-Guyanese female friend, Taletta, meets the moment when a local journalist confronts them with a recording device to get a student's point of view to share with the larger national public. For whatever reason, Michael is at a loss for words and is rendered speechless. Taletta, in contrast, steps in and says, quote, "We're all committed to the cause of justice. We feel strongly that this blatant act of banning a lecture is arbitrary and unconstitutional and violates human rights. We are defending his right to freedom of movement. After all, we are all West Indians," end quote. So this is the only moment when Rodney is depicted as a singular iconic figure. Instead, the novel frames the Rodney affair against the more mundane quotidian details of managing life in this northern Caribbean city, and the shock of the outsider taking in the sharp contrast of Kingston between the middle class and the slums that he will later encounter. But that Taletta's character opens and closes the novel and appears at key moments along Michael's journey demonstrates, in this instance, a commitment to capturing the female voices among the marchers, which prompts these two friends to have a more deliberate conversation about leadership. And so here's another quote. Michael, we had to tell them something, she smiled. It doesn't matter that it's absolutely true, that it's not absolutely true. The point is to make war noise of thousands, even if there are only hundreds on the road. That's strategy. Michael says, but who authorized you to employ this strategy? Suppose the organizers don't want that kind of statement made. And she says, which organizers? I don't see any organizers. You see any organizers? The march continues with the narrator capturing the cinematic, performative qualities of both the marchers and the police. The soldiers inside the lawn of the Prime Minister's residence pointed rifles, quote, one adopted a cinematic pose, feet astride, ready to fire from the hip. And yet, the narrator is careful to say, among us, there was not the slightest fear that something calamitous could happen, right? And so what he's articulating is this abiding fear, abiding faith in the police force up until what subsequently happens. So their collective, unyielding faith that somehow their status as students would protect them from police violence is abruptly shattered when, quote, a jeep load of soldiers followed by wailing police cars sped towards us from the opposite direction. The soldiers lost no time in forming ranks and donning gas masks. The dramatic swiftness with which the roadblock was set up spelt measures severe and merciless. Toletta gripped my hand. For crucial minutes, we all stared with a mixture of fascination, horror, and disbelief at their costuming act. There was a kind of silence lasting tremendous seconds when you hear only the sound, the loud accelerating rhythm of your heartbeat. We didn't wait to test the mood, the air, or our strength. Pierced this time to a nerve root of fear, always nearer the surface than we wanted to admit, we fled, even as the first canister burst, even as the soldiers, looking hideous and irrepressible, advanced at walk. It was as if an old war trumpet were blasting over and over a single panic-filled message, run for your life, end quote. So the novel foregrounds spaces of sociality so that crowds, parties, and communes are spaces of transformative action. In the midst of this confrontation with police, Michael is separated from his group and has a coincidental meeting with Juba, a Rastafarian who instructs him to get on his motorbike and then proceeds to take him into his community, a community so outside the footprint of Michael's usual city movements. So on the back of Juba's bike, he sees and is transfixed by this other Jamaica of wretched shacks baking in the sun so that the whole area looked more like an abandoned rubbish yard, end quote. After the catharsis of that eventual day, campus life appears to return to the status quo. Toletta says to him, it's real funny. We started out protesting in the name of Black Power and end up in a soda fountain. Do you think they were serious? And he says to her, weren't you serious while you were in it? And she says, I suppose so. Something inside me finds this sort of thing full of sound and fury, but really getting nowhere. It never lasts. It's as close as I can get to being a part of something enormous, something apocalyptic. Is that the word? What I mean is, when you read about Marxism and peasant revolts and great upheavals in history, don't you get a feeling of being somehow outside it all, somehow inconsequential? Just you in a stuffy city of thousands scratching for existence? Doesn't it make you want to leave home, jump off the island and go? I know I could be big and fabulous, help turn the pages of history if I could expand, stretch my limbs, race around the rim of the world. Look, I come from a relatively small country where things like riots and strikes are like games of perverse cruelty we play on each other. If, as I've waited and watched things happen everywhere, read about the outside world, felt its movement, after a while it comes to possess you, this urge to make everything you know real, to ship out in the dark seas and to discover new lands. So, end quote. Yet readers, so if that's what it means for Toledo, readers come to realize that for Michael, this October confrontation has profound reverberations, in large part because of his chance encounter with Juba, sets the stage for his conversion from Michael to Eichel in part 3 of the novel, suggesting that, that this political confrontation becomes personally transformative. While he does not see Juba again in the flesh, over dinner with Albertine, his lover and leftist academic, Juba appears on the TV screen as news of his death circulates in the evening news. The broadcaster proceeds to characterize him as a criminal caught up in a police trap for a ganja plane making a pickup. Albertine, who otherwise valorizes drumming, Haiti, and other African-derived musical practices, immediately agrees with the media's framing of Juba, whose legal name is announced Hibbert. But Michael resists the narrative. I don't believe he's a criminal. That's what I'm saying. This fellow talked to me about his life. It was nothing like that. That's not his style. To which Albertine responds, not his style. Criminals are criminals, whatever their style. And on this island, there are gunmen who would do anything to get money. Try and understand that, end quote. So reading Juba's naming and framing of himself against the official government record profoundly impacts Michael as he recognizes the ease with which even those on the left, as in his partner, are willing to slot people into prescribed roles based on appearances. So the net sum of Juba's impact prepares Michael to shed his own identity when he encounters in Albertine's flat a country teacher who is suspended for his radical Black Power teachings to students. The novel's title, when the teacher's suspended from his job, the novel's title begins to make sense because the teacher is the one who renames Michael Eichel. And Michael adopts Eichel, I would argue, as at once a declaration, a confirmation, and a rejection. And so by way of conclusion, I want to suggest that with Eichel Taras, N.D. Williams is after the period sensibility and sociality where crowds, parties, and communes are the spaces of transformative action, spaces where different nations and classes of people come into contact with each other in public spheres that are being redefined and personal lives that are being remade. Rather than the streets of London, the regional university is a space of West Indian identity making. While the novel chronicles the misadventure through this 1968-69 school year, the book is actually published in 1976 after a period of reflection. So 1976 then provides proximate distance to re-engage the October 1968 confrontations. That Casa de las Americas sees the events the novel chronicles as prize-winning, captures a regional vision not hamstrung by linguistic difference. Revisiting these texts from the context of a political present, our political present, reinvigorated by global youth movements such as Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the Tambourine Army, might strike a chord in visceral ways of not only the power of social movements, but the injustice of social conditions that compel everyday people to mobilize and take to the streets to demand justice. Eichel Taras adds significantly to an archive of the period structure of feeling where the Rodney affair and the subsequent October 68 confrontations are narrativized from a fellow Guyanese living at the UWI Mona campus. Thank you.
There we have it, three quite interesting presentations. I now invite questions or comments from members of the audience. There are two standing mics located in the aisles. Please be free. And please introduce yourself first before asking your question or making your comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Roberta Kilkenny. I have two comments really, or question comments. The first one has to do with this notion of lunacy or madness, and I'm curious to know your feelings about the extent to which the broader population sometimes explains away otherness as being lunacy or madness, and if that links to having heard government officials and so forth using that within the legal sphere, and it then becomes part of the broader thing. And the reason that that question came to me, my first time in Jamaica was in 1969, almost a year to the day after these things. And I then had what in the States was called a leaping fro, which is the Angela Davis fro. And I often heard people calling me mad as I walked down the streets. And my host said, not only are you mad, but your hair attracts bugs. And there seems to be, to me, this acceptance within the broader society that the person who behaves in unacceptable ways must be doing so out of some mental illness. My second comment is directed towards Brother Tennyson, and it has to do with this notion of a Rodney model of an activist scholar. And I would suggest to you that you look at some of the other aspects of Walter's life and activities, which also are related to education, but in a less formal way. His exposure to the political activities of the People's Progressive Party in Jamaica, which his parents were part of, from childhood. His attendance at Queens College during the colonial period, but when the PPP was in office within that kind of colonial framework, because the PPP successfully invited a number of progressive people to come and teach in the schools, including Sylvia Winter and others, which I think was a unique experience for him. His participation in the study group led by CLR James while Walter was attending SOAS. So the formal institutions Walter saw as providing him with a certain kind of discipline that he could then use in his study of history, but then bringing history outside of the campus environs. And certainly the study group was something that he himself would use when he came back to Jamaica to teach, and throughout the rest of his life until his assassination. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Would you like to respond to the comment?
Microphone. Microphone. Okay, I'm not very sure how to really answer your question about this issue of otherness, but all I can say is that the way in which the colonial authorities actually viewed this kind of madness, and I've seen it as well in literature in other colonial states as well, that somehow this idea of declaring you mad was a tool which they could draw on as a way of controlling you if they couldn't control you in another way. So all I can probably say then is that somehow that idea somehow now have carried on, where in our normal folklore, we have copied and also probably used the same idea, the same flexible idea that once you are unusual, they must be mad. So apart from that, I really can't comment otherwise, apart from that.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments?
Sorry. Yeah, Joe Pereira is the name. I wanted to comment on the third paper to congratulate you because I don't think there's been much study of Eichel Taras. But it's just to add some information. Noel Williams tried to get it published for some time, and the standard publishers would not accept 501 pages. They wanted him to cut it down severely, and he would not. Casa de las Americas opened their annual prizes in literature to the English-speaking Caribbean for the first time in 1976. And 3 persons won prizes from the English-speaking Caribbean in that year, one of them being Noel Williams, otherwise called Wick Williams. And they had no problem with publishing the entire manuscript. He has tried to get it republished in, shall I say, Western publishing houses, and the same problem, it's too long. The second thing is the tremendous realism in that novel, that Eichel is based on Eichel, who was mentioned, Barbados Eichel, Ras Eichel. He was the prototype for that character. Of course, he didn't come from Guyana, but Noel Williams came from Guyana. I would also point out that Noel himself had to leave St. Lucia after he graduated from Mona because he had started to tell them about Rastafari in Jamaica at sixth form. So when you mention that section where the teacher had been put out of a school because he had been talking about Black Power Rastafari, I think it is autobiographic that has been woven into the novel. I would also point out to what is very interesting. You had quoted Eichel in his discussion with his left-wing friend who had sort of dismissed Juba. And that is an indication of the broader ideological issues, that the left generally were insensitive to many of the realities in the society and tended to be rather dismissive of many of the realities in the society. And so, in a way, the character Eichel finds in Rastafari an ideology that is more, shall I say, more congruent with his understanding of Caribbean reality. Thank you.
Jerry, one sec. We have a comment or question from Sir Roy here.
A short question. I wonder why you did not attempt to distinguish between the attitude of the colonial office and what you described in Jamaica. It seems you were confusing what I think is a confusion, but not only by you, to use the phrase and the adjective colonial in front of conspiracy instead of calling it by its name, Jamaican. I thought the last paper, I found it very interesting, and there's a UWI conspiracy in this room. There is a question that for me, jumps out of your paper. Why did the Colonial Office not interfere after, first of all, the governor's report or assessment of Bedward's true, perhaps, influence, or see it in the light of the division within Jamaican society of white and black? Why did the Colonial Office not interfere? The year 1921 jumps out at me as a conclusion that I've seen in other aspects of the Colonial Office minutes in regard to Caribbean affairs. 1921, the period after the First World War, of the decline in the interest of the Colonial Office in the English islands and the Caribbean. And one of them, incidentally, although it slightly contradicts, but it shows some point of my wonder, in the Barbados literature, or papers anyway, I noted how in 1921 there was a proposal in the Barbados literature for University of the West Indies. For what it's worth, I suggest that there is a field here, those of us who think of the Colonial Office as having done great work for the minority of the white population, to see in true ways the diversion between white and black, the division between some white people and other white people, as well as between some black people and other black people.
Okay, right. Well, from my understanding, the report the governor sent to the Colonial Office, in a sense, there was no real concern for Bedward at that time. What I later, from my understanding, is that it is after that report that it is said that he took a turn to become much more seditious. But in that early period, the government report, I think, to the Colonial Office was satisfactory, that the concern that you are hearing is not so. And I think, and I could be wrong here, but there was an alarm was first made by a report in the Daily Gleaner, which was carried all across the place. And that is how the governor got himself decided to investigate the gentleman, Bedward. But he was satisfied with what he saw and sent it off. From what I also learned, that later it is said, and this is a part of the trial, that later on now he became more seditious and more daring. And that is why then at that time, but initially they were satisfied with what they saw and that he was no threat. Although you could read between the lines to say that they were concerned that his power and influence could be misinterpreted by this large following, and that was really what the fear was, from my understanding, that they were really afraid that the masses were so vulnerable, and by just speaking in neutral terms, the masses could decide that, oh, he's asking for a revolution, and turn things over, and that's why he was being watched, and that's why every week they sent policemen, plainclothes policemen and policemen in regular uniform to actually record what is being said. So if after 3 years they couldn't have arrested him, it was quite clear that what they were saying initially then, there was really no seditious language. So while that part of the day, so it's a story that I will continue to follow. Yeah, we hear it.
Anyway, Eichel, based on Eichel, Michael Hutchinson. His father was what? Deputy or Governor General about it?
Rodney might know.
Eh?
Rodney might know.
Yeah, my grandfather was the Governor General. And he was at university here. Well, that guy, you know, he was one of the most wanted in Jamaica at the time. The guy went based on, them call him Juba. I didn't know him as Skipper. And the night, the 16th of October, he came up here and he came to me and he showed me some gun. And he said he can make them available. And that him will help us to do what we want to do. And also, the way how him writes it in the book, the first time he hailed Eichel, remember what him call him? What? No, you don't remember. Him says student.
Right, Juba, yes.
Student.
Come on the motorcycle, yes.
That's the very way him approached me. I was not a student, but him assume and him hail we as student, you know. And everything is 80 pages out of that book describe the march itself. In between the march and Juba Yard and going back out onto the street. And there was many other characters in there that were real, including the same lecturer lady with them, when based the character and who, because she never gave up herself to no man, them start spread rumor about her, say she a lesbian and all them things. And there's plenty more things in there, but it was very realistic. Thank you.
Dave, I have a little question to you. It's kind of ironic that your paper was on the way in which the state authorities would use the law of madness to deal with people who are difficult. But it's almost like a full circle kind of situation. Like the last major incident we had at the Cavell campus was when a lecturer called Dr. Christina Hines Harrison mounted a protest, a one-woman protest or a three-woman protest against the same Ralph Gonzalez that was the leader of the 1968 issue. And her protest was based on the way the state used the law of insanity to deal with a young Vincentian model called Yogi Farrell. So I'm just wondering if you want to make any statement in relation to whether or not that kind of tendency continues today, or how you see it expressing itself in modern day political practice, and whether or not the human rights persons who we encountered during the last 2 days cannot see it fit to make it an issue, a central issue as part of their human rights activities to deal with that specific use of the law of insanity in Caribbean legal system. Because basically anybody that the state has a problem with, it is very loose. I don't think it's very tight. That's one of the reasons for her protest against the Gonzalez leadership, that she was saying that perhaps we need to look at that, because a repressive leader can identify somebody who they see as troublesome and just I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you the details of how it operates, but it's very, very loose, that almost anybody who's troublesome can be targeted. Thank you.
I mean, all I would say is that the neo-colonial state, the neo-colonial state and the colonial state, there are similarities. My paper looked at practices in the colonial state, but we have to remember that a lot of the practices in the colonial state will be picked up in the neo-colonial state, and probably that's part of the continuity, right? But from my reading, I mean, I've seen articles also in African societies, same colonial period, saying the same thing about the use of madness as a tool throughout. So it was a common practice. And as such then, it's not surprising that the neo-colonial state will continue the same practices, especially nearer in independence period. No, surprisingly, no, in what we call probably the more modern period right now, it will be still strange to see that thing. Because by now we would have probably become much more observant of some of these practices, but it's not surprising that the neo-colonial state is still practicing some of the same colonial strategies.
All right. Thank you. Any more questions, comments?
Hi, congrats to all three presenters. I really enjoyed your papers. Darn it, I need to read that novel. I'm really excited. My question is for Tennyson. This morning at Brian Meeks's lecture, as you know, he's given 3 talks in the last 3 days, and his basic overall theme has been to bemoan the lack of imagination in addressing the failure of neoliberalism, which has been evident for 40 years, but everybody just keeps doing the same old thing. In the Q&A for the session this morning, somebody noted that UE has produced probably most of the prime ministers, who obviously would be the ones perpetuating the whole or unable to fight the neoliberalism thing. So I was just wondering what your comment would be on that.
Actually, there was an award at Kville for the 70th anniversary just 2 Fridays ago. And one of the prime ministers who got the award, because UE is trying to give iconic Caribbean, people that passed through Kville, they were being awarded. And one of the prime ministers, speaking on behalf of the 70 people, spoke a lot about the period in which they were governing. So there's a lot of discussion about they were governing in the most difficult and challenging period. And so that was the explanation, or if you want to call it an excuse, that was given, right? One of the ways in which I try to think about it is that in the larger global, my own work on that question of neoliberalism, I've argued in relation to the larger global. So the period 1960 to roughly 1980, a different global environment existed. And between 1980 onwards to 2000, the global arrangement which had sustained the kind of spaces the post-colonial state had was much limited. So they would many of them actually come from a radical tradition. So some of the prime ministers, Ralph, Kenny was in the WPG, Ralph was always part of the left. But there was a period in the late 1990s when all the left of center leaders, except perhaps the one in Grenada, Chris Michel, had become prime ministers in the region. And they were actually governing when, for example, in the case of St. Lucia, when the banana arrangements had changed in England. And their argument was that they were transitioning the economies into modern economies out of the old preferential dependent agricultural economies into finance and services and so forth. Owen Arthur is a good symbol of that in the case of Barbados. The model of development was neoliberal because that was coming out of 1980 after the Grenada Revolution and the Nassau Declaration out of CARICOM. It was a neoliberal model, and they lived through that difficult period. Many of them left office around the time of the collapse. So 2008 is the era of the collapse of the neoliberal model, and we're now living through it. The best way I'm not making an excuse for them, but I would certainly, I see some logic in their argument in relation to the global movement and when they found themselves in office. But I still feel like there were room for doing more creative things. Ralph is a good example of one, I think, who has tried to do creative things. For example, his links to Iran, Libya, Venezuela, and Cuba to build his airport. So he found ways to build his airport in a context where you would say external sources of finance have been limited and they've dried up, but he used a kind of creative international relations tool framework to get it done. So I don't think it was impossible. I am stammering for an answer. The global is a big explanation, but also it should also blame themselves for not being creative enough. I think many of them were overwhelmed by the challenge of managing the state, the debt crisis, and so forth when they took office, and they did neoliberal things in response. And sadly, or perhaps logically, many of them have also paid a political price for it as well.
Okay. Thank you, Tennyson. And with that, our session has concluded.